Begin quote. Kissinger projects a strong impression of a man at home in the world and on top of his brief. But there are a number of occasions when it suits him to pose as a sort of Candide, naive and ill-prepared for being easily unhorsed by events. No doubt this pose costs him something in point of self-esteem. It is a pose, furthermore, which he often adopts at precisely the time when the record shows him to be knowledgeable, and when knowledge or foreknowledge would also confront him with charges of responsibility or complicity. End quote. Quote. Not all the elements of this partitionist policy can be charged to Kissinger personally. He inherited the Greek junta and the official dislike of Makarios. However, even in the dank, obfuscatory prose of his own memoirs, he does admit what can be otherwise concluded from independent sources. Using covert channels and short-circuiting the democratic process in his own country, he made himself an accomplice in a plan of political assassination, which, when it went awry, led to the deaths of thousands of civilians, the violent uprooting of almost 200,000 refugees, and the creation of an unjust and unstable amputation of Cyprus, which constitutes a serious threat to peace a full quarter century later. End quote. Quote. The burden, therefore, rests with the American legal community and with the American human rights lobbies and non-governmental organizations. They can either persist in averting their gaze from the egregious impunity enjoyed by a notorious war criminal and lawbreaker, or they can become seized by the exalted standards to which they continuously hold everyone else. The current state of suspended animation, however, cannot last. If the courts and lawyers of this country will not do their duty, we shall watch as the victims and survivors of this man pursue justice and vindication in their own dignified and painstaking way, and at their own expense, and we shall be put to shame. End quote. Quote. Some statements are too blunt for everyday consensual discourse. In national debate, it is the smoother pebbles that are customarily gathered from the stream and used as projectiles. They leave less of a scar, even when they hit. Occasionally, however, a single hard-edged remark will inflict a deep and jagged wound, a gash so ugly that it must be cauterized at once. End quote. Quote, those who willed the means and wished the ends are not absolved from guilt by the refusal of reality to match their schemes. End quote. And when I heard the news last night before last by the time you're watching this, of the death of Henry Kissinger, I knew at once what my remit was going to be here tonight. To give voice to the words of the late Christopher Hitchens, who, a little over 20 years ago, investigated the life and career of Henry Kissinger as thoroughly and objectively as has any journalist before or since, and concluded that in the final analysis, his subject was one of the most monstrously repugnant creatures ever to stalk the stage of U.S. geopolitics. And do I have some of my own words that I want to share on the matter? Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, I do. Hit the music, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where December 1st is the saddest day of the year because it means the leftovers are all gone. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. American, all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And before we continue with the Henry Kissinger obituary, or indictment, pick whichever word you like better, I guess. There's big breaking news that just came across the curmudgeon wire as we were about to go on air. Bob Iger is stepping down as CEO of the Disney Grooming Syndicate with 3 full years remaining on his contract, no less. And as delightful as that bit of news is, it makes it all the more sweet that it arrives the very next day after Iger was the victim of the worst public bitch-slapping ever administered by one billionaire to another. And you know, I was just going to describe what happens in this video clip, which some of you will have surely seen already. But even with my prodigious powers of explication, I can never do this thing justice with mere words alone. So let's watch.
But there's a public perception that that was part of a apology tour, if you will. That this had been said online. There was all of the criticism. There was advertisers leaving. We talked to Bob Iger today.
I hope they stop.
You hope?
Don't advertise.
You don't want them to advertise?
No.
What do you mean?
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go fuck yourself.
But
go fuck yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob, if you're in the audience.
So to recap, for those fans keeping score at home, Bob Iger quit his job in humiliation and disgrace less than 24 hours after Elon Musk, in what is probably the most badass display of alpha male Chad energy since Theodore Roosevelt took a bullet in the chest and then proceeded to give a 2.5-hour long campaign speech, looked him directly in the face and told him, 1, get the hell off my platform, stay gone, don't let the door hit you in your smug, smarmy ass, and 2, while we're at it, you can go fuck yourself. And that douchebag interviewer guy, he looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him up. He didn't have the faintest idea what to say or how to react. Now, the background to all this, for those of you who may not know, is a couple weeks ago, Media Matters, which is basically the online enforcement arm of the Democrat Party at this point, they cooked up a ridiculous fake bullshit story about how Twitter is supposedly overflowing with ads for neo-Nazi content. Now, what product would neo-Nazis be advertising? Unclear. And right on cue, Disney and the rest of the usual woke virtue-signaling corporate suspects made a big performative show of saying, we are pulling our ads off Twitter until Musk gets control of this hateful right-wing content. The place is such a sick cesspool of moral depravity now. It was so much better when it was a woke left-wing echo chamber that we could use to rig the election and cudgel our enemies with. Now, this is the point where a reasonable person with a functioning prefrontal cortex might say, wait, isn't he probably quitting because all the shitty woke Disney movies are flopping right and left one after the other, and they've lost a reported $800 goddamn million from the last 5 flops alone? And in a sane world, yes, a CEO who wrecked a company that badly probably would be impelled to resign in disgrace. But we're not in a sane world. In fact, all things being equal, Bob Iger would have been more than happy to play out his contract and leave Disney as a ruined brand and a financial 5-alarm dumpster fire, because it's not about making money for the shareholders. It's about the message. So make no mistake, Iger is quitting because he simply can't handle the fact that Elon Musk made him look like a complete and total bitch in public right to his face. And I imagine Kathy Kennedy is going to drink an extra box or 2 of red wine tonight in gleeful celebration of her nemesis being vanquished, but I suspect she's going to be following him out the door, whether it's by walking out or getting forcibly thrown out, in fairly short order. If she thinks this is a reprieve for herself, she's probably wrong. And the same goes for you, Kevin Feige. I wouldn't be giving too many high fives around the office tomorrow is all I'm saying. All right, having now dispensed with that little bit of deliciousness, back to the matter of Henry Kissinger. And you know what I never would have expected? I never would have expected this man to be eulogized so fawningly, so hagiographically, so uncritically by so many commentators on the right. I watched Sean Hannity's monologue last night. Not because I wanted to, because who would ever want that? But because in this business, from time to time, there are certain necessary evils in which one has to engage. I'm reminded of that time I watched an entire evening of the MSNBC primetime lineup, and I did it for you. An experience from which I still haven't completely recovered and perhaps never will. But I watched Hannity last night because I wanted to get a sense of how the news of Kissinger's death was being received by the conservative commentariat. And my God, man, to hear this dude talk, it was like history's greatest statesman had just shuffled off the mortal coil. Because apparently, if you worked for a couple of Republican presidents and it was long enough ago for everybody to mostly forget all the policy details, well, that means you were an awesome guy who did a great and admirable life's work. Meanwhile, back in the real world, if we take stock of every vexing geopolitical issue that currently afflicts us as a country, one would be hard-pressed in the judgment of this reporter to identify a single one of them where Kissinger wasn't the author or the co-author or didn't do something to make it very much worse during his time as Nixon's national security advisor and later as Jerry Ford's Secretary of State. There's lots of things for which this man deserves to be very strenuously criticized, including things most people have long since forgotten about: Cyprus, Chile, Cambodia, and so on. But for our purposes right now, I want to focus on Vietnam and China. As you may have noticed, the Chi-Coms are mourning Kissinger today as if they have lost the best friend they ever had, which, as a practical matter, They may have done, but let's go chronologically here, which means we have to start with Vietnam. Now, when Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968, he ran as an anti-war candidate, just as pretty much everybody in both parties did that year, unless their name was President Lyndon Johnson, who, of course, dropped out of the race after nearly losing the very first primary in New Hampshire. So at that point, we had broad bipartisan agreement among all the candidates that the Vietnam War was a failed, foolish enterprise, that we were gaining little to no benefit from the deaths of the 100 fine young men we were losing every week, hat tip to Johnny Cash, and that the chances of us actually winning the thing, victory in this case meaning a unified Vietnam under a democratic government, were somewhere between slim and none. And this message resonated most powerfully coming from Richard Nixon for a couple of different reasons. One, because he was in the opposition party and not the ruling party, and two, because he had more anti-communist street cred than any other national political figure by far. So if a guy like Dick Nixon is saying we have no chance of winning this war against communism, then he must really, really mean it. Henry Kissinger did not work on Nixon's campaign. In fact, on the day Nixon offered Kissinger the job of National Security Advisor, it was only the second time the two men had ever met. Kissinger was still just an academic at that point. He'd written a couple of books, written a bunch of opinion columns, and everybody agreed that he was a really impressive sounding guy and a prodigious intellect. They said, wow, this dude seems to really have his finger on the pulse of world geopolitics. We should bring him into the administration. If he's right about all these things, he's going to make us all look like freaking geniuses. And this is a thing that happens from time to time in American politics. Someone will emerge from the halls of academia acting like they've got the whole world figured out, writing really impressive sounding papers, giving really impressive sounding speeches, and people start believing, hey, maybe this person really does have the whole world figured out. It's the same thing that happened about 20 years later with Condoleezza Rice, who incidentally had exactly the same career trajectory that Kissinger did. From academia to National Security Advisor in the first term, Secretary of State in the second term. Now, which one of them caused more harm to the country? I think we could have a very lively debate trying to figure out the answer to that question. So, Nixon wins the White House on a platform of, let's get the hell out of Vietnam. A platform that Kissinger had no part in formulating, but once he's been installed as the NSA, he says, you know, Mr. President, we don't necessarily need to pull out immediately, do we? See, when Nixon assumes office in January of '69, there were already peace talks going on with the North Vietnamese. But Kissinger quickly convinces the new president that the last thing we want is for this war to end in a way that the previous administration can take any credit for. So we need to shit-can these peace talks and get back to bombing some motherfuckers, which they did for 3 full years. All the while, every week, we're still losing 100 fine young men. What are they dying for? Unclear. But all of a sudden, shit, it's 1972 already. It's time to run for re-election. And I haven't really done a goddamn thing to fulfill that campaign promise that got me elected in the first place. We need to get some peace talks going pronto. Not so fast, says Kissinger. Times have gotten better here at home. People are less pissed off about the Vietnam thing than they were back in '68. Your chances of re-election appear very strong, so let's not go rushing into any peace talks too hastily here. We need to look like we're negotiating from a position of strength. So I say, let's go bomb the shit out of North Vietnam. Like, really bomb the shit out of them for a good 5 or 6 months. Really flatten the place. And then they'll have no choice but to come to the table and sign whatever piece of paper we put in front of them. I've even got a cool name for it. We'll call it Peace with Honor. And Nixon says, well, I like it. You're a goddamn genius, Henry. And so was born Operation Linebacker, which remains to this very day the biggest strategic bombing campaign anywhere in the world since the end of the Second World War. And Kissinger, he spent the last 50 years of his life making cute little jokes about it. He was fond of saying, well, first we bombed them to the negotiating table, then we bombed them again until they took the deal we offered. And this always earned a hearty round of belly laughs from whatever room full of career diplomats and defense contractor types he was getting paid $300,000 to speak to that evening. The families of the hundreds of American pilots who got killed and or captured in Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2, they probably didn't think it was all that funny. And Linebacker 2, of course, was the second part of the joke. Linebacker 1 lasts from May until the end of October. And it gets the North Vietnamese to the table, all right, but they are still thinking that this is some sort of negotiation. So, just so there's no confusion, Christmas week 1972 sees another orgy of strategic bombing, 20,000 tons in total, basically the same as Hiroshima, but in smaller little bite-sized doses. And hey, would you look at that? The Paris Peace Accords get concluded in January of 73. They signed the deal we put in front of them, just like Henry said they would. Now, could we have gotten much the same deal in the summer of 69 and kept 15 or 20,000 American servicemen out of an early grave, shot to shit in some rice paddy in the ass end of the world? Yes. Yes, we could have. I mentioned a couple of moments ago that as 1970 turned into 1971 and then 72, the American people were generally less upset about Vietnam than they had been a few years previously. And part of that was because the economic situation was improving at home, as it often does when a Republican administration takes over from a Democrat one. And on the world stage, we just need some sort of a big old distraction here. Hey, how about if Nixon goes to China? Boom! There it is! Bob's your uncle! A rapprochement with the Chi-Coms. That'll more than make up for the fact that we've escalated the war in Vietnam rather than ending it like we said we would. Nixon and Kissinger are going to look like the greatest statesmen and diplomats in world history. It'll be great. And yeah, it was a political masterstroke. You can't take that away. Nixon gets reelected in one of the most lopsided contests in the history of the Republic. He pays no political price whatsoever for failing to get out of Vietnam like he said he would. Meanwhile, the opening of diplomatic relations with the Chi-Coms, it of course legitimizes that regime on the world stage, and 7 years later, Jimmy Carter finishes the job and completes the American betrayal of our most faithful World War II allies by stripping diplomatic recognition away from Taiwan, transferring it to the Chi-Com regime, and the rest of the world and the United Nations all quickly follow suit. Would Chinese communism still exist today without Henry Kissinger? I'm not prepared to state that unequivocally, but I think there is a very, very strong possibility that it would not. In any event, judging by their reactions to the man's death, the Chi-Coms sure seem to think he materially improved their position in the world, and they ain't wrong. Now, Henry Kissinger had a big advantage that many men in similar positions do not enjoy. That is to say, a 50-year-long retirement in which he was able to largely write and curate his own legacy. You remember the old Winston Churchill quote, "History shall vindicate me, for I shall be the one writing it." And that can have a powerful effect upon public perception when you're in your 80s and your 90s giving speeches to groups of people, most of whom were not yet born during the events you're describing. Thus they have no means of knowing any better. Thus they are more inclined than they should be to accept uncritically your version of events. Did Henry Kissinger do some good things in his life? Sure. Are they outweighed by the bad things? Yes, I think they are, and I think it's not particularly close. And if it sounds like I'm speaking in unduly harsh terms about a man who's been dead less than 48 hours, well, I make no apologies for that, because I don't like it when history gets whitewashed or obfuscated for any reason for any man. To Henry Kissinger's family and friends, I extend my most sincere condolences. May he rest in peace. Thanks very much indeed for watching. See you Sunday, Blaster 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. Do feel free to light me up in the comments if you think I deserve it. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.